Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Richard, good to see you.
Good to see you too, and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, how are things at the Citadel where you teach?
Everything is great. I have great students, and it's a beautiful day out today. It's supposed to be about 80 degrees for those in the Northeast who are suffering snow again. And by golly, I'm proud to be an American, even if not completely free one.
Yeah, well, you're in the beautiful city of Charleston, which of course brings up our big conference that we're having. They're on April 29th, Sunday, from 1 to 5 p.m. on foreign policy and non-interventionism. We're doing this, the Future of Freedom Foundation is, in partnership with the Ron Paul Institute. So we got a great lineup, Richard, you and me speaking, and we pat ourselves on the back a little bit and do a little self-promotion. And then we got Dan McAdams, who runs the Ron Paul Institute, and of course our featured speaker, Ron Paul. We got a special guest, Congressman Mark Sanford, that's going to be attending and making a few remarks. So we already got a big crowd already signed up, Richard. Kind of exciting that people are interested in this topic and our conference here.
Absolutely. I've mentioned it to a number of groups and organizations here, and there's quite a bit of enthusiasm about having the opportunity to hear, of course, Ron Paul, but also us, and on the general theme of a challenge to the conventional wisdom on American foreign policy, and to ask the fundamental question, what foreign policy of a free America is most consistent with the founding principles and ideals of a government that defends your liberty rather than oppresses it? And I think it's going to be a great program, and I highly recommend for people who may be in the greater Charleston area or maybe coming down here for a holiday weekend to take advantage of a great program that does not come everywhere all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's got Charleston. I've been to Charleston a couple of times. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the country. It's a perfect excuse to visit Charleston. You can, the weather is likely to be perfect, April 29th, and you've got those horse-drawn carriages that give you tours of the old mansions there, and it's just absolutely an awesome city. And you've got cadets that are coming over from the Citadel, which is a real testament that there's college students here at a military school that are interested in this topic, non-interventionism. I think it's a testament that you're teaching there, and that you've told me that there's other people with libertarian perspectives that teach there. I think it's a real testament to the Citadel that you've got this sort of libertarianism percolating there on campus.
Yes, in fact, all of my economist colleagues who also teach in the Citadel School of Business would view themselves as libertarian/classical liberals. My business colleagues who teach the business courses, many of whom have been in the world of free enterprise themselves before coming here on a permanent teaching basis, also strongly believe in the principles of the free enterprise system and the institutional setting of a free society that makes it possible and sustains it. So from my personal perspective, this is a great institution to be having the opportunity to share free market ideas with students.
It really is, and it's a perfect segue to what we're going to talk about today, and that's public schooling, the role of government in education, because so many young people, including millennials, not just students, but people who have gone through the public school system and the state educational system, with respect to foreign policy, are just disasters. I mean, I've seen it here in the libertarian movement with young people that a lot of them are interventionists. And, we take our message to them of non-intervention, and it's all too often received negatively. And I think the basic reason for that is the indoctrination that is part of the state educational system. And, there is homeschooling as an alternative, and there are private schools, but even the private schools are licensed, so a lot of them are scared of losing their license, so they They sort of mirror the public schooling system. But most kids are defaulting into the public school system. And as you and I have maintained since the very beginning that FFF was founded in 1989, the primary purpose of the state's educational system is to mold young people into accepting the official doctrine that this is a free society, that the CIA, the Pentagon are protecting our rights and freedoms with their escapades overseas, that the welfare state is freedom. And this indoctrination, takes place day after day, 6 or 7 hours a day, 5 days a week over an 18-year period of time. By that time, most kids are their fulfillment. They really believe that the CIA is essential to their freedom, that the Pentagon's invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan are bringing freedom to people. Oh, and most important, that the troops overseas are defending our rights and freedoms, despite the fact that no one overseas is threatening to take away our rights and freedoms. And so this is the real disaster of public government schooling. And another manifestation of it are these protests. You see all these kids out here protesting for gun control. You see that they wouldn't even conceive of protesting against the government's killing of people abroad. I mean, if you count the number of people that the government kills abroad compared to what happens here in the United States with sometimes a mass killer, the numbers are incomparable. The government kills hundreds of thousands of people, but you don't see these kids protesting against that. It's only, protesting in favor of gun control, as if that's the panacea. But why do they do this? That's the indoctrination. That's what they receive in these public schools, of becoming good little citizens, defer to the authority of the state, and do everything you can to restrict freedom among the private citizenry. So, yeah, this is the ultimate disaster of public schooling, and not only what it does to kids' minds, with attention deficit disorder and putting them on drugs and so forth, quashing out the natural thirst of learning, but really what it does to kids' minds in terms of indoctrination, propaganda, and deference to authority. What do you think?
Well, let me first reiterate some of the themes that you just brought out. The fact is that if one goes back into the history of public schooling in the United States, that is, compulsory mandated attendance at government schools in the middle decades of the 19th century when it began. The idea was precisely that young minds had to be molded into a uniform conception of what it meant to be a good American citizen. Waves of immigrants, various backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, cultures, and there was this idea among, by golly, American nationalists that these waves of immigrants should not be allowed to bring in their alien ideas, that their children had to be taken away from them, as you're saying, a certain number of hours a day, and to be remolded into a particular vision of what it means to be an American. Now, what's important also perhaps to appreciate is that the template of what is the official American line of American history, American politics, what it means to be a good citizen, has changed over time. Now, for example, when I was a mere lad, that's the 20th century, not the 19th, Jacob. When I was a mere lad, in history classes, for example, in high school, for instance, junior high school, you would read that Christopher Columbus was a wonderful man. He had been an explorer who discovered the New World and was the stepping stone to the building of a great America. And the history textbooks would always have these pictures of industrialization in the United States in the second half of the 19th and early 20th century. Pictures of smokestacks billowing the smoke into the air, railroads traversing the country with the smoke coming out of the engine and so on. And that was the party line. America was good, great, because it was, by golly, a free country that had brought industrial strength to its people. Now, fast forward about 40 or 50 years later, there's still a government schooling propaganda line, but it has merely changed. and that is, well, Christopher Columbus was an evil, obviously sexist male white person who had crossed the Atlantic searching to exploit people and plunder the land and bringing diseases to innocent natives who otherwise would have lived a pristine existence, one with nature. And that having plundered and massacred all these people, then other white Europeans came and they built these factories to billow out pollution and particles of harm to humanity. And all of the history of America is an example of the destruction of the little marginalized people and the eradication of a pure and clean earth for all of humanity over the future generations. Now, those are different stories, okay? Those are radically different stories. But those were the government official stories as captured in departments and divisions of education that had responsibility for determining curriculum, standards for hiring students, hiring teachers, for example, to be teaching students in grammar school, junior and high school, and that they had to be licensed through an educational process in which the teaching methods and teaching subject matter would be given to them as the template in which they would teach. Now, whether one wants to believe the first of those stories, Christopher Columbus was a wonderful guy, and industrialization increased the betterment of humanity, or whether you want to say that Christopher Columbus was a bad guy and it brought around degradation, harm, and ruin. The fact is that these are the monopoly stories. Every child in government-mandated schools were required in the past, and its version now in the future, to learn this. Now, a teacher may emphasize something different. The textbook in one school district in one part of the country may be a little different than a textbook in another school district in another part of the country, but it's basically a party line to indoctrinate young people to accept these are the values, the beliefs, the principles, the ideas that you should hold about America and people and the society in general. It is an indoctrination process. You may agree with the content or you may disagree with the content, but it remains an indoctrination process to mold minds, as opposed to an open, competitive educational setting in which different curriculums compete. Different teaching methods are devised to make schooling of interest and a challenge and a pleasure for students, and to decide what is valuable and what is not. And this would be reflecting what parents certainly wanted, since they would be paying for their child's education with the abolition of private schools and the ending of all taxes collected for that purpose. In schools having to demonstrate their excellence and their challenge to students in a good and positive way, and that what these students were learning were meaning and relevant and reflecting what parents themselves might want their children to learn, and setting them on a career path for a profession, an occupation, a line of work that would offer them both fulfillment and a decent living looking forward to their own time in the labor force. But until that is established, the ending of teacher licensing, as you said, the abolition of all public and government schools from kindergarten, and I would argue through the PhD graduate program in universities, we will have a situation of monopoly education, a template of curriculum in which students are basically brainwashed to believe a certain thing is good or bad about America, its founding, its principles, its institutions, its culture. And it will block off the avenues of a really competitive market for alternatives reflecting what consumers want, which means parents and students, a competitive arena in which it would be price possible for parents to send their children from anything from kindergarten into graduate school. And it would offer a motive and incentive for teachers from K to PhD to devise ways of teaching that are relevant, meaningful, and make learning something desirable rather than something that is an ordeal, as many young people feel it to be.
Yeah, I mean, what we're really talking about as libertarians is a free market in education. I mean, look at what we have with religion. We have a separation of state and church. We essentially say that the state will stay out of the whole area of religion. Let people decide, and some people decide not to go to church. Some people decide to go to this church or that church, but we leave government out of the equation. That's what we libertarians say should be applied to education. A total separation of state and education, where the free market rules, where parents decide the best educational vehicle, where you have entrepreneurs competing and vying with each other to provide educational vehicles, where parents can treat kids differently, where one kid might want to go to a school, another kid wants to stay at home. But people sometimes say, oh, well, gosh, nobody would get educated. Well, this is nonsense. Every child has this burning thirst to learn. You can see it in every kid. He'll be in a building when he's just like a baby and his eyes are wide open. He's absorbing everything he can. And then as they grow older, they start bedeviling their parents with that infamous three-letter word, why? Well, every kid wants to learn. But ultimately what happens with public schooling, the state's educational system, it destroys that love of learning. It teaches them to memorize and what is part of the indoctrination. It molds their minds in such a way where everything becomes how to please the teacher, how to please the authorities by doing things the way they want, and that destroys that natural thirst for learning. And one of the best examples of this is with millennials. I mean, these people that are in their early 20s now, mid-20s, they've grown up, Richard, in the post 9/11 era. Now, what did we hear about 9/11? What was the official story? That the terrorists had stricken because they hate us for our freedom and values. And that's the story that's just pounded into students from the first grade on up, that this is all because they hate us for our rock and roll and our religion and whatever. The terrorists just hate us. And so it's necessary to invade Iraq. It's necessary to invade Afghanistan. It's necessary to have this war on terrorism, to have the NSA have surveillance on us, to have the CIA engaged and the Pentagon engaged in assassinations. Well, it was all a lie. I mean, as we have been showing since before 9/11, this is all in reaction to U.S. foreign policy, interventionism. But young people don't hear that side of it. And after 12 years, the indoctrination, unfortunately, is so complete that when they hear us libertarians, they recoil, they rebel against this notion that the government was the one that brought this about through foreign interventionism. And so they resist what we libertarians are saying. That's how powerful the indoctrination is. You see it with adults. And the classic example is thanking the troops for their service. That mantra. Oh, thank you for your service. In Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, what's the service? Well, they say, well, they're protecting our rights and freedoms. What does that mean? There's nobody in Iraq that was ever threatening to take away our rights and freedoms. Same with Afghanistan. I mean, at worst, they struck on 9/11 in retaliation for what the government had been doing prior to that time in the Middle East, but nobody was trying to take our rights and freedoms, and yet this indoctrination is so complete that people repeat this mantra, thank you for protecting our rights and freedoms, when it's just obviously false when you look at it in an objective sense. And so that's the power of indoctrination. One of the best examples, I think, in this area, when you and I were growing up, was with respect to Cuba. During the whole Cold War, Cuba is a threat to national security. It's necessary to invade Cuba. They're a dagger 90 miles away from American shores. National security is at stake. We can't survive. We have to assassinate Fidel Castro. The fact is, if you look at it objectively, Cuba never attacked the United States. They never threatened to attack the United States. Even when they brought Soviet missiles in, it was to defend against another U.S. invasion of Cuba, like the one at the Bay of Pigs. But yet we were all indoctrinated with this notion that Cuba is a threat to national security. Well, what does that mean? Are they going to invade Miami and work their way up the eastern seaboard and take over the federal government and run the public schools? Nonsense. One final thing about Cuba, I visited there over 10 years or so ago, and they have a museum there in Havana showing what the CIA has done against Cuba. The assassination plots, the sabotage, the terrorism, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And when I visited this museum, they had all these school kids there learning what the CIA had done. And I thought to myself, this is what public schooling is all about. I mean, even if much of what they said is true, they're indoctrinating students with their official version of what's going on. Just like over here, we were being indoctrinated with our government's official version of what's going on. So yeah, I say the public school system is much like Army Light. That, you know, you get drafted into the Army, you're indoctrinated into believing who the official enemies are going to be. You learn to defer to authority. You learn not to question things. Your mindset is molded in that first, couple of months of boot camp. That's what happens with public government schooling. Your mind is molded over 18 years so that by the time you get to be an adult, the chance of breaking through to the truth, which we libertarians are advancing, is minimal. But there's always hope, because you and I were products of this system, Richard. We believe this nonsense, and yet we achieved a breakthrough, and I think that applies to a lot of libertarians. So there is something to be said for the promotion of ideas on liberty and truth, because they do enable some people to break through.
I want to sort of follow on other aspects of this and themes on it. One is that schools often become hotbeds of political and social and cultural controversy for a variety of reasons. Think of the debates and arguments and heated shouting that have gone on in the past in some public schools in certain parts of the country about, well, should young people through in grammar school or high school, should they be required to say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the school day? Shall evolution versus creationism be taught in science classes? Or shall creationism be viewed as if it's a scientific explanation, because those who are challenging it say it's just a philosophy or a theology? And one sees is these battles among parent groups over what will be taught in the schools. Why? Because they're monopoly institutions. Either this group in the society gains hold of the department or the Board of Education and imposes this curriculum, or the other group will gain control of the Board of Education and impose this curriculum and required behavior on the part of students. Now, this is not the case in any other part of the private sector. I go into the supermarket, and the fact that I put certain items in my shopping cart and go to the checkout stand with them does not require me to get your permission to do so. And I can't command you as to what goods you're going to put into the shopping cart. We each fill our shopping cart with the goods and products that reflect our values, needs, desires, and economic constraints. If education was privatized in the full and comprehensive way that you and I have been talking about, these hot button issues that have arisen in the past in some school districts around the country would just disappear. You want your child to go to an institution where a sense of, quote, patriotism is emphasized each day as symbolized in the doing of the Pledge of Allegiance. That's where your kid goes to school. If you think that this is really necessary and it's just bunkum, or you actually think that it's teaching the wrong attitudes towards the country and citizenship, you send your kid to a different school. Okay? You send your kid to a different school without any problem. They don't take a Pledge of Allegiance. They don't do this. The same thing would apply for science classes. If you believe strongly in a literal interpretation of the Bible, and you think that's the education your child should receive, well, you send your child to a school that will emphasize more of those things. If you are either not religious or someone who may be religious but believes that human reason has taught certain things about the scientific evolution of man and the globe, the world, the planet, then you send your kid to a different school. Then there's a competition of attitudes, beliefs, teachings, and curricula. And then they have a chance to compete, to debate, to argue, to influence each other. But when the curriculum is a monopoly curriculum for all the students in a school district, so it's either yours or mine, then it becomes a clash of control as to who shall determine what all young minds must learn, even if many other parents don't desire it. And if I could just make one other point, because some people will say, well, this is all well and good, but how do you privatize schools? Well, let me just suggest a couple of scenarios. One is that on a certain day, the teachers and the staff and the administrators of a public school are told, we're going to privatize this institution, and we're giving you the opportunity to be given the shareholding rights of this. In other words, we're privatizing it, and now it's yours as the current employees of the institution, if you choose to take ownership. And then, just like any other business, it's your responsibility to maintain, operate it, attract student and parent customers, and to devise curricula and teaching methods that will make parents to want to send their kids to those schools and keep them in those schools. With the success of your institution as a private school and maintaining your jobs is dependent upon your success in satisfying consumer demand. Another way is just to put all schools up at public auction as an option. And it may be a standalone school that someone in a community would like to take over and operate as a private school, or it could be like a franchise business where there's some mother corporation that wants to have a national or regional chain of schools, wants to buy them up at a public auction, and then either run them directly from the mother company or to then sell them off as local franchises under their brand name logo of a curriculum, a teaching style, a competency test, an attitude towards education that they would then market. Well, if you send your kid to one of our schools, this is what you can count on, and compare us to the rivals in the marketplace, because your kid only has one chance of an education before they're an adult and move on, and we think that we're the ones that can offer the best one. Then commensurate with that, taxes would be abolished of any way, shape, and form that have been going into the funding of these public schools, these now defunct government schools that have been privatized. And with a cut in all those taxes, that for many, many families would provide much of the financial wherewithal to be able to afford directly themselves the tuitions for these private schools. And the other advantage of privatization is that now, since the schools would be competing to attract parents and students against their private school rivals, they would also have to devise ways to have excellent, yet in a cost-efficient way, to keep the tuitions as low as competitively possible, to make the students coming to your school more financially attractive than some other competitors. So you see an increase in quality, a falling or at least a cost controlling of tuitions over the long run, and a diversity of views rather than a monopoly. Those are the advantages that could arise with private schooling from kindergarten through the PhD.
Yeah, and the repeal of compulsory attendance laws. I mean, we often forget that coercion is really the basis of the system. And you pointed out that with taxation, I mean, there's coercion with taxation. You don't pay your taxes, they'll put you in jail. They'll seize all your assets. So here you have this institution that is coercively funded. It doesn't rely on the voluntary actions of people in the marketplace as businesses do. But there's also that compulsory attendance law, that if parents don't submit their children to a state-approved education in whatever fashion, homeschooling or private schooling, licensed, or public schooling, where most of them default to, parents go to jail. Yes. Now, you don't see that often because parents simply comply with the law. They take their kids to the bus every morning. But that's the coercion that underlies this system. Now, imagine that. I mean, here you have a natural process of seeking. That's what education really is. It's seeking knowledge. But here you have coercion that's being put on top of what really is an invigorating enterprise of education. Well, coercion and that kind of enterprise are opposites. You're going to do damage when you do this. And this is the thing that we often ignore in all this process, is the damage that coercion does to kids, seizing them out of their homes at an arbitrary age. Some kids are not ready to leave home at 6 years of age. They're better off staying at home. Why not let families make these decisions, giving them a wide range of choices, as you outlined, that a free market would provide them. Instead, you use coercion to seize them, to put them in these government institutions. And so, most kids adapt. I mean, they conform to this Army light, just as many draftees conform in boot camp. But there's inevitably kids that don't respond well to this coercion. So they sit there and they're bored. I mean, you've got government employees and school teachers are among the nicest people in the world, very devoted, very passionate. But when you've got a bad system, a system based on coercion, the system's going to win out over good people. And so you end up in this government institution where, it's arbitrary time periods. If a kid gets interested in the subject, he's got to move when the bell rings. He can't keep pursuing that subject. And they get bored. They're some of them want to just walk around. They don't like this system. And that's when they get diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, as if something's wrong with them. Because, in the minds of the administrators and the minds of many parents, this is a normal institution, one based on coercion. And so the thought that their kid is healthy, that he's responding in a very healthy manner to a dysfunctional coercive system doesn't even enter their minds. And yet the kid is acting normally and reacting against this, but they diagnose that something's wrong with him. The counselors, the administrators advise drugs, Ritalin or Adderall. The parents think they're deferring to authority. They're victims of the indoctrination that they receive. They think these people know what they're doing, and inevitably, or all too often, they put their own kids on these drugs, where they stay on these drugs forever, and with all the horrible side effects that come with these drugs. The best parents are the ones that say, no, to heck with you, and they remove their kids and they find better alternatives for their kids rather than put them on drugs. But it's that system of coercion, Richard. It's impossible to measure the damage that it does to children's minds.
Let me just add one thing complementary to that. Maybe some listeners of yours would say this coercion business, that's very extreme. Government really doesn't do bad things. Now, it is true that the example that I'm going to give is one that is few and far between. But there was an instance sometime in the 1960s and 70s. I remember seeing a story about it on the evening news. I think it was maybe when, I'm dating myself, when Walter Cronkite was still the anchor for the CBS Evening News. There was a traditional Mormon family in Utah. Yes, he had multiple wives, and they were all living in one compound. There was no indication or assertion of child abuse or misconduct. The father and the mothers were not sending their children to the local public schools. Police authorities were sent to this man's ranch or farm. They surrounded it. He came out one day to collect his mail from the post box at the end of his property. And in the back, they shot him dead for failure to send his children to public schools. And his children were taken out of the custody of the wives, the mothers, and placed in foster care to assure that they were sent to government-run schools in the local area. Now, I have no idea what the upshot of that eventually was, separate from the tragedy of the guy being killed. Were the children ever returned to the mothers? I have no idea. And I admit that is a case of few and far between, but it shows that the ultimate power of the state, even on a matter of truancy, not sending your kid to a public school, is that they can assert the authority to compel you, even with the threat of death, to obey their commands, that your child is educated where they say. And that should not be forgotten, even though admittedly it's few and far between.
Yeah, I think that's the case of John Singer you're talking about, that got shot. And I saw an upshot to it, that the kids grew up, and a few years ago I read an interview about them, and where they were being interviewed, and they were just condemning the state for killing their father, simply because the father wanted to homeschool his kids. This is when homeschooling was illegal. Yes. And they shot the guy dead. But the kids grew up understanding that the state had done something really bad here. But yeah, that's the real core of coercion. Is that if you don't pay your taxes, as Leonard Read once pointed out, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, they'll kill you. And yes. And the logic of it is that if you keep resisting all the way down to the point where they foreclose a lien on your house and try to deliver possession to the new owner, and you say, you're not taking my house from me and I've got a gun here to protect myself, they will kill you. They'll call it resisting arrest, but they will kill you. And that's the heart of the coercion. And I think that's what's so unhealthy in this entire process. Well, Richard, we're running out of time, unfortunately. And as always, greatly enjoyed the conversation with you.
Me too. And I want to, once again, as I always do, to thank our viewers and listeners for sharing a little bit of their time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in, and hope you guys join us in Charleston, South Carolina, April 29th, Sunday, 1 to 5. Fly in the day before, do a nice little tour of Charleston, and we hope to see you. Richard and I are going to be speaking there. Dan McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute. Ron Paul himself will be there. Special guest, Congressman Mark Sanford. I think it's going to be a fantastic conference, and certainly on one of the burning issues of our time, if not the most important issue as far as freedom's concerned, and that's foreign interventionism, the guiding foreign policy of our age. So great to have you all tuning in, and look forward to seeing you next week. Richard, see you next week.
Bye-bye.